Indologists who came here who would have their professional artists to make drawings of the sites they visited, but these kinds of things were just travelers who wrote reports and who wrote, there's this image and so many arms and so many heads, and then they would go back with the text, and there would be some artist in Europe who would like just use his fantasy to... Exactly, so that's why I would think that this type of illustrations is earlier than the 18th century. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm not formulated the question completely in my head, but it's a couple of points which struck me. One was I was thinking of the differences between the three modes, like worshipping the image, worshipping a deceased monk, and then worshipping a live monk. And then you spoke about the blurring between meditation and ritual. So could we say that, I mean, I was just thinking whether, so there's a blurring between a dialectical relation with the object of veneration and the reflective mode, right? Where you're, so instead of a self-other relationship, you have more of a self-self relationship. So I was wondering if you've looked at Jaina theories of the self and how they could help us understand this. Because for me, if the image is not supposed to reciprocate, then why are you constructing it as a self-other relationship? I mean, can we rethink of it as a self-self relationship? And then what are the theories of the self from Bhaṭṭārakas, Jainism, which would help us understand this? I mean, it's kind of a convoluted question, but...
Which kind of a question? Which kind of a question?
It's a little convoluted, but
okay.
It's very these are the strands. Yeah.
It's very interesting. I don't think I'll be able to answer much to it now, but well, the thing that performing this kind of a ritual in front of an unresponsive Jina image might be more of a, that's what I call the technology of the self. So that's what I suppose that's what you're calling a self practice. Is that what you said? Yeah. So the question was?
So what are the theories of the self in Jaina theories of the self? You know, because Indian philosophy has different theories of the self.
Yeah.
So what, like, is there a connection between the Jaina theory of the self and this technology of the self that you're looking at?
Okay. Should I ask help from specialists or try to make an explanation myself? That the basic Jain understanding of the self is that there is an Atma, which is eternally pure, eternally energetic, which has always been there, but only through some reason which we didn't find an explanation for. Karma has started bounding upon our still infinitely pure soul and makes it difficult for us to see the truth of that soul. So the self is an eternally blissful, pure, energetic jiva entity which is always there. So that's the basic understanding of the Jaina self. But that's not a full explanation.
You have to emulate the values of the image you are worshipping as aims that you should strive for.
And if I could use this, since I asked this little bit to the Bhaṭṭārakas yesterday, may I ask it to you again, if I could be forgiven? Which is that...
I'll be able to give a better answer than he did, whatever the question was. But
the question was simply this, that much of this can be just seen as psychological good health. Like all this meditation as in a purely secular space. Why this overblown spiritual rhetoric? Why is it needed? So,
overblown spiritual rhetoric, is that in the Jaina scriptures or in my presentation?
No, in this kind of, you know, I mean, one could make a case for good mental health, well-being. I'm not sure what is added by all of this other stuff. So just...
Well, it's a perfectly valid question.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's a question I asked myself, and I agree with the validity of the question. What I would try to highlight in the way that you're asking a question is that you're starting from the presupposition of there being two categories. You have secular technologies of the self and you have religious secularities of the self. I would actually say, why stick to these two religious categories, which are themselves a product of religious Christian imagination? Why not just see indeed both as equally valid means? That might not be, one difference would still be that, for example, Jainism would still have a very strong moral, ethical code attached to it also, which would say that you also have to stick to these and these moral rules in order to be able to get some effect from it. I mean, if I'm allowed that anecdote, that's a very strong distinction that I've experienced from talking to what is the name? I practice Vipassana meditation myself, but you have these what is it called? The awareness. This no, this so popular. Yeah, well, there's Vipassana, but then what is being propagated and practiced so much in the West? No, just mindfulness. I was so unmindful, I couldn't think of the word unmindful. In a conversation with a mindfulness teacher once, this is what struck me, that this mindfulness teacher doesn't give any ethical or moral teaching. He would say, well, I have a patient who comes to me and I teach him mindfulness for half an hour and then he goes home. And then I asked him, well, what if the patient drinks alcohol at home? And he says, well, that's the patient's responsibility. I don't care about that. As long as he returns the next day, and I'll give him another session of a half an hour. Whereas, for example, Vipassana or Jainism would also tell you, well, you might want to consider abandoning drinking alcohol, because as much progress as you make, as much regress you will be making by drinking alcohol. So, I mean, I'm drifting, but my answer is, why hold on to the categories of this is religious and secular? So I agree with you that there shouldn't be any difference, but let's forget about the conceptual difference between secular and religious to start with. But the ethical teachings do come along with for example, these Jaina teachings as well. And if they sound overblown, that is a pity.
Thank you, Tillo. But the question I wanted to ask you was that if I had heard your talk and the presentation, without, of course, those photographs of those monks, it could have been a talk on ritual and devotion in Hinduism.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And why I am saying that is not as a critique of what you did, but to say that the space in which one makes sense of this question of the ritual and devotion is to look at this extensive writing and practice in Hinduism. Now, this is always very difficult to say these things because, you know, in present day, the claim that everything is Hindu is which means that taking Jainism and Buddhism into Hinduism, and maybe other religions too, you know, it could be seen as something like that. But what I'm trying to point out is in the context of ritual and devotion, and I've been asking this question in the ritual and devotion, and there's a question I've been asking, so I'm coming back to it again. If historically I see Jainism as an atheistic religion, and comes with a, you know, arises with a particular kind of a purpose, and then it gets modified into what I see as very mainstream Hinduism in the context of ritual and devotion. So, for example, the question about prayers, right? I mean, the question of whether you get something from the deceased monk, etc., is not a, you know, it's not even a surprise or a problem in any sense of the word, because one of the forms of prayer in Hinduism is, you know, you could see it as thanksgiving, or it is just singing praises. So singing praises, for example, is a very common form of prayer.
What is?
Singing praises, you know, singing, composing poetry and saying how great you are, how beautiful you are, etc. So the point is, eulogisms, if you like. So I'm just curious about this, you know, the lack of the H word in all this.
The lack of the?
H word.
Meaning?
Hinduism.
Okay.
That missing link, you know, so therefore in the larger, you know, context of ritual and devotion, I'm trying to find out why, I mean, of course, I think John Cott, etc., I myself also invoked him here. Why in this context of ritual and devotion that you may not, that you do not perhaps find, or maybe you are working on it, I don't know, that you are not looking at Hindu sources on this extensive working on ritual and devotion and prayer in that, you know.
Thank you very much. There's much in your question and reply that I should be replying to. I won't be able to. Why am I not looking at Hinduism? I started with a basic historical research question about this specific part of Digambara history, and I'm just so very happy that it is learning me a lot about what I see very explicitly, very consciously as wider phenomena and wider practices of ritual and devotion in India. So I am seeing this as a case study, and well, let me put it differently. After having visited India for a few times, just traveling and studying Hindi and Sanskrit, I suddenly realized that I had no idea whatsoever what is going on in the head of a Hindu when he goes to a temple. You know, just suddenly was aware this should be a very basic fact of knowledge, but I've never even started reflecting on it, nor have I read about it. And in this project on Jainism now, I'm starting to to get a little introduction into it at least. I'd be very interested to do a next research project on ritual and devotional practices in Hinduism, and indeed John Court does refer to not just the parallels but the mutual influences. He says actually at one point that the veneration of the Acharya might actually have been, well, you might have read it, might have been a basic influence for the original of Bhakti traditions, for example. So that would be a case where Jainism actually stood at the root of specific Hindu practices. I'm very often, or at least I remember being very surprised by hearing arti performed in a Hindu temple sometimes. I mean, visiting Jaina temples, and suddenly I was in a hotel room and heard an arti melody coming, and I was sure, oh, there must be a Jain temple here because I recognized the melody. And I went to see, and it was a Hindu temple, but they sing the song, they sing the same melodies, etc. So these are all parallels indeed, which show that you are right in showing that this is a broader phenomenon. But in your reply also, I heard a few presuppositions which I would disagree with. For example, you said that Jainism and Buddhism, and that's something which came up in the last few papers also, started out as an atheistic tradition vis-a-vis the Vedic tradition, so it was kind of a reform movement, etc. I don't see any reason why we should actually hold on to those views neither. What do we actually know about Vedic ritual? That might have been a devotional, venerational practice just as much as Buddhism and Jainism have, and in many other ways also. I think it's not very fruitful to keep thinking of Jainism and Buddhism, or original Jainism and Buddhism, as something which reacted to Vedism, that a priori sort of like conceptualizes the traditions of being distinct entities which had no relation whatsoever. So, and the second part, which is a stereotype which always occurs, and you all also made kind of the next step would be that you have the traditions starting out of this as these pristine different traditions, and then in these dark Middle Ages it started meddling, and you get some kind of what's the word again, synthesis of different traditions, etc. Why do we need to think of it in those terms? I mean, you can also see the whole Brahmanic Shramanic environment as just not so strictly divided into different traditions.
Well, you could. Sorry, just take a minute. I mean, you could, but the point is that we have very good reasons for believing that there was a kind of an antagonism which arises. For example, we know the shift from languages, the kind of languages which are used, the kind of textual strategies which are used. So the point is also not to go to the other extreme and say there was no conflict. So what is of interest is how does this cultural amalgamation happen? And within that context, for example, the syncretic of Christianity, like the bhakti things you are hearing, you could go to Tamil Nadu and you're sitting outside a church, you will hear a prayer which sounds like your temple prayer, you go down, it's a church. So wherever Krishna is there, they'll say Yesu. And you can't make out. There are Carnatic songs, a very famous one, Vatapi Ganapatim, which is on Vata Ganapati. There is a Christ version for it. When I first heard it, I was shocked. It is where instead of Vatapi Ganapatim, it's about Yesu. Right? So there are reasons to, and we need to make sense of it. We can't say that is how it was syncretically. So there is in the history of the intellectual traditions, how do we make sense of this? Right? So that is the question. I'm saying the question of prayer and tradition has a very strong overlap with certain kinds of practices and philosophical preoccupations of Hinduism. How does it allow us to understand Jainism? I'm not even saying they should differ, they should be the same. I'm just trying to say how would we even understand Jainism?
Yes. No, we can just assume this is concluding into the concluding session, right? So there is a half-hour space. Is that okay, Meera?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
While showing the footprints of the Acharya and the Bhaṭṭāraka, you used the synonym in Sanskrit. It is Paduka. It is utterly wrong.
Should be
Paduka
Charana?
means footwear. Footwear is Paduka. Footprints, Padachinha, that should be used.
Yeah, Charana Chinya, Paduka Chinya, there's
not Paduka.
I'm not the only one meddling up. People in the field, Jains, also use the terms intermittently. I know about the theoretical distinction, but if people in the field also refer to these as Padukas, and 90% of them do, then I'm happy to do it just as well.
If they say like that, you should correct them.
Who am I to
You
correct
have the
them?
right to correct. No, you should enlighten them. They are not Padukas, they are Padachinha, footprints. Another thing is...
Well, the manuscript also called them Padukas. You've seen that Puja Path, which says Guru Charana
If
Paduka.
manuscript says, I need not agree with that manuscript.
Yeah, but he's an ethnographer, he's an
Yeah,
anthropologist,
okay.
so it's not his duty to do that.
I have many of those manuscripts.
Okay, Tillo, you can respond to Sundar's question. I think, I'm sorry I interrupted.
Yeah, I don't think I'll be able to respond to that now, but it's pretty interesting material for sure. I thought actually the thing you were saying about the Christian church melody sounding like would actually be confirming to my point of view rather more. Well, there's literature, I can't think of the orders now, which actually deconstruct or rethink those kinds of descriptions of Jainism and Buddhism as originating in response to the Vedic tradition, which very nicely point out, using citations from those Indologists, Western Indologist descriptions, which show that they're actually seeing a parallel to the European Protestant Reformation, and they would call Rice Davis, the Polytech Society, Rice Davis, he would say that the Buddha was the Martin Luther of the East. So again, I mean, and I could get you the references, but you might know them, that those people, those contemporary authors show that those Indologists were actually again guided by their own preconceptions about religious development, and much more explicitly about the development of the Bhakti traditions. Also, they saw specific preconceived developments of religion which taken place in Europe, so they just supposed that they would also have taken place in Europe. So that's what guided them in their description of Buddhism and Jainism as reactions to the Vedic tradition, as a kind of a parallel to European Protestantism. That's a part of a reply also, but that leads you to further remarks, I see.
No, I won't. I just take one line. Because I've written about this earlier. I've sat in places, and Professor Mishra will tell you, in traditional Orthodox discourses, where the abuse between the Vedantins and the Buddhists is so deep and intense. You don't have to have Indologists from Europe telling us that.
Yes.
Yeah. That is nowhere a connection between Buddhism and Hinduism which is present. These are Orthodox people who are talking about the way it was 1,500 years back.
Exactly.
And they're abusive, they're not even just being nice and polite about it.
And
So I
within
think
the
the
same
point,
tradition.
whether the Europeans understood it or not is a different issue. But within the practices of these traditions, it continues.
And even Buddhist continue.
Buddhist continues enormously with all the,
Even the previous presentation that Preeti gave, for example, shows this conflict. It's essentially talking about how
And
Well, I
there
don't think
is,
I wanted
uh,
to present the
in
pre-colonial
Mylapore
Indian
church,
past as
they have
peaceful.
Dwajastambha.
yeah, but that's,
No, I just wanted to make this distinction when you are using the term ritual. So ritual as technologies of the self vis-a-vis rituals as conforming to norms.
Sorry.
Rituals as conforming to some set of norms. So, for example, when you invoke the idea of mindful practices, when you are conforming to just a norm in terms of ritual or in terms of hedonistic consumerism, it doesn't make much of a difference. You can easily do both of them together. So Zizek's analysis of Buddhism in US and all these mindful practices. So when you are doing rituals as just conforming to some norms, and even in India it's largely prevalent, even when I did rituals.
You mean performing rituals according to a specific procedure?
No, I'm saying the distinction when you are performing rituals as in self-awareness of having these technologies of self, which is a meditative act, which is transformative in some ways, or you are doing rituals just as conforming to some set of norms because you are part of that cultural milieu.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm saying that conforming to set of norms, if you look at rituals as that kind of a distinction as in will give you two different ideas of rituals. And the second interpretation of rituals goes very well with any other, like I was saying, any mindful practices, any kind of meditation which is very, a very psychologically, mentally helpful act is not really the rituals that you are trying to claim as technologies of the self. They are more than that. So how do you then look at rituals as just conforming to norms, and which I don't know how you looked it in your field work, how it came about, whether they are really using it as technologies of the self in the Foucauldian way and getting transformed through it, or was it a...
Thank you. Well, those few descriptions which I showed you, which told us that the Jinnah image is an exemplar to be emulated, etc. Of course, these are highly idealized descriptions of what it should be. When you visit the temple, you can easily see that this layperson might actually be thinking about what he will be doing this or that day in his shop while he's doing those things. So, I mean, that's a very easy criticism, but at the same time, these people do visit the temple. Not all Jains go to the temple for such extended practices, of course, but those who do, they get up every morning at 6 o'clock and they are there and they do those bodily physical actions. So at the same time, even if they might be distracted at some points, like I would be distracted during my meditation practice as well, they are still training themselves physically and mentally in a certain way. So it still is a mental exercise which makes you develop in a certain way. So even if the ideal is not always fulfilled, even if it is sometimes just following the procedure of this and that dravya, it still is an absolute, I mean, not a, similarly as you would have physical exercises, it is a mental, psychic exercise. So
self-awareness doesn't really count. Like even if you don't have the self-awareness of doing these rituals with some kind of a...
Of course it does, but at the same time, the purely the discipline, some people would say, how do they say it in Hindi, niyam se, main niyam se mandir jata hu savere savere har din. Like, you know, the regulation, the practice, the discipline itself is like a preliminary condition, you know, to
that awareness.
Yeah.
To awareness. You need to have the discipline in order to have the awareness. So it's not about whether the awareness comes first or... So it's a more cyclical process, and it's a more evolving process. You may not reach complete awareness or whatever it is, and you reach, you get parts and parts of it, and that's through discipline. That's through the...
Yeah, what does one say as a remark to conclude such a 2-day intensive workshop? All of us have been taken to different worlds, different contexts, and I have had the luck that all the people whom I invited came. A few could not come, and that way we are missing glimpses of other worlds as well, and there are many other worlds within